Hello, everybody, and thank you very much to the organisers today for inviting me. Really excited to be here. A little nervous because I'm a little earlier in my academic journey than everybody else, but hopefully I can offer some contribution today. So the reason Andrew invited me along today is because I've just recently completed my undergraduate dissertation project we supervised before. In a nutshell, the dissertation looked at how one group of traditional evangelical Christians infer a series of marital directives from one literal reading of the Bible, and how they subsequently use those directives to curate and impose a marital paradigm of female subordination to their husbands. So there are many different verses of the Bible. There are many different speakers and figures of authority within evangelical Christianity. But the specific verse of the Bible which I was concerned with when looking at this paradigm was Genesis chapter 2, verses 18 to 24. As well as that, in my research, I was concerned with how the paradigm in particular had an impact on women, rather than how it had an impact on men or the marriages altogether. I was concerned with the impact on women. So my research kind of looked to cover three questions that I had when I began researching. The first was, why do evangelical women choose to adhere to this paradigm if, as suggested initially, they are to be prescribed a secondary position in relation to their husbands? Secondly, what is the impact of them adhering to that paradigm? Does it have an impact on how satisfied they are within their marriage? And does it have an impact on how satisfied they are with their individuality and themselves? And thirdly, off the back of responses from that second question would it be possible for there to be a shift in the paradigm which would improve their experiences without compromising their religious commitments? So soon I hope to just run back through those three questions and talk about what I found. But before that, I'd just like to talk about why I chose this topic in the first place and why specifically I wanted to focus on the impact that it has on women. So when I was deciding what to write on, as I mentioned earlier in my academic journey, I feel now looking back that I had a little bit of a misconception about traditional religious outlooks and literal readings of scripture. And at the time, I was under the impression that it's quite simple, that traditional religious outlooks, literal interpretations of scripture, are just totally incompatible with modern day narratives on feminism and gender equality. I had a conversation with another student at the time. He was studying his PhD, and he said, it sounds really interesting, what you're planning to write on. But I think that when you actually begin to research the topic yourself and you look at the scripture yourself and you begin to bring out your own literal interpretations, you might be quite surprised that a lot of the research currently actually goes against that. And the idea is that it could be potentially the case that traditional outlooks on religion and modern narratives on gender equality could be reconciled. So not only that, as I think Andrew mentioned earlier on, another misconception which I was probably guilty of, and I think many people are, whether that's inside or outside of the field, is that, well, people aren't really that religious anymore, or people don't really understand and respond to literal readings of scripture. But actually that's totally untrue. That's not the case. So for me, I wanted to see whether those women in particular who were concerned with literal versions of the Bible could reconcile that commitment with gender equality and feminist attitudes today. So just going back to the first question, which I think I started with in my research, why do women choose to adhere to the paradigm given that they will be subscribing to a secondary position within their marriage against their husband? And what I found quite soon was that central within many traditional evangelical Christians' outlook is that biblicism is totally integral. So that means receiving and responding to a literal interpretation of the Bible is imperative. It's And the answer to that, there are not only reading scripture for themselves, but actually receiving literal interpretations from figures of authority, from sermons, from preachers. And through that, frameworks and guidelines and instructions for how they should live their lives seem to be curated. So then bringing the focus back to what I was concerned with for this research, I wanted to see what preachers and what sermons currently say about Genesis chapter 2, verses 18 to 24. Ultimately, what I found was that there seems to be one shared translation and one shared understanding of those particular verses, and that is, in a nutshell, that Eve was created both from and for Adam. So Eve was created from the rib of Adam to be Adam's helper. That understanding, that translation has worked to inform the view that in marriage, a woman is inherently almost secondary to man within marriage because she is his helper and she was made from him. So what this told me was that women are aware that a lot of the time in traditional evangelicalism, they're aware that through marriage and through following the instructions of their faith, they will undertake a secondary role. But it appears that concerns surrounding that are set aside because what's integral to them is that they are meeting the conditions of their faith, i.e. receiving and responding to a literal interpretation of scripture. So with this in mind, and for myself as someone who doesn't respond to a literal interpretation of scripture and religion in its most traditional sense, I suppose I kind of wondered, well, what impact does this have on those women? Does it impact how they feel about themselves, how they feel about their marriage? And at that stage, there was lots of evidence to suggest that, yes, it does. It does have an impact on their psychological well-being. It does have an impact on how satisfied they are within their marriage, in particular when they're contrasting their marital framework with alternative marital frameworks, such as those practiced by non-religious people. So that might be that the husband and wife undertake egalitarian gender rather than more traditional gender roles. So at that stage, it was clear to me that for many traditional evangelical women, they understand that they must set aside what they would prefer to implement within their marriages in order to avoid jeopardizing their religious commitment. So that meant that the impact was they would prefer to adopt a different model, so they weren't entirely satisfied in their marriages. And also they suffered from low self-esteem, almost frustration, because what they would prefer wasn't meeting what they felt they ought to do. So this almost troubled me for several reasons, not only the impact that it has on women psychologically, but what stood out to me was the idea that my preconceptions appeared to be proven right. It did appear at this stage that traditional literal readings of scripture do not sit hand in hand with gender equality, and it did have negative impacts on women. And it not only that, it also appeared that a woman feels as though she must set aside part of her identity and her preferences in order to protect her religious identity. And that just didn't feel right for me. So that almost brings me on to the third question, which I think I addressed in my research, which is, would it be possible for there to be a shift in that marital framework which wouldn't jeopardize their religious commitments, but would improve their quality of life and their marital satisfaction? To do this, I knew it was important that the integrity of their literal readings of scripture shouldn't be jeopardized. So what I decided to do was refer to existing exegesis on the same scripture, which had worked to inform the original paradigm, and also invite my own interpretations, which were really careful to stick to a literal reading of the Bible. So going back to what I mentioned earlier about what seems to be prevalent in traditional evangelical understandings of Genesis 2:18 to 24, it appeared to me that the idea that woman was created both for and from man substantiated much of the paradigm. So the idea that woman was made from the rib of Adam and as Adam's helper appeared to be quite significant. So what I thought to do was actually look at those two words in themselves, rib and helper, in their Hebrew form from the Bible. And straight away, so much research saying that actually this translation, which has been shared by many traditional evangelicals, amongst other Christians, actually is not consistent with the same usage of the word in their translations elsewhere across the Bible. So for me, as somebody who was trying to be really careful to gauge a literal reading to see if there was alternative ways to read the verses, I thought, well, surely a consistent translation across the Bible would be the best way to infer that literal interpretation. So the research that I came across suggested that elsewhere across the Bible, the use of the word Ezer, which has been translated by traditional evangelicals as helper, has actually been better translated and understood as a strength or a counterpart, a strong counterpart. And the same for the use of the word rib elsewhere across the Bible, that has actually always referred to an entire side rather than a rib. So for me, there was no reason that those two translations couldn't be implemented in Genesis 2:18-24 to reflect an equally literal reading of the Bible. Yeah, so what the impact is on women there is that women are almost forced to choose between one of several aspects of their identity. So in this specific case, it was for women to choose between their religious commitments or their preferences within their own individual and personal marriages. That's problematic because of the reasons I outlined earlier. So the effect that it has on their individual well-being and their marital satisfaction as well. But it could be the case that with alternative readings of scripture, which might come through the individual rather than through institutions and rather through situated figures of authority, actually there could be the potential for the identities to work compatibly rather than there having to be a choice. Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much, Chloe. Fantastically well done and very much appreciated, and sincere apologies for the technical issues.
Let's use your Zoom because there we can see you. Yeah.
And I'll leave that microphone on, but hopefully you can talk. I can see you, and hopefully you can talk there. It looks like the internet is still fluctuating here, which is really annoying, but kind of we'll get there. Chloe, thank you very much indeed for that. So maybe let's just, if it's all right, just talk a little bit more about that word help for a second.
Yeah.
In that usually it's probably assumed that if you use the word help, that means some kind of inferiority. Will you help me do this job? Usually implies somebody who's much more junior to you, but yeah, that's not what the Bible seems to mean by that. Is that the case?
Yeah, so from my understanding now, having completed this, I think there are different ways that you can understand the word help. And the most positive outlook on that for women could be the idea that they're position as helper wasn't one that was secondary, but one that actually almost raised the two of them to form a unit. So man required the helper just as much as the helper was required to help man. So rather than it being a almost systematic one above the other, it was actually a unit that they were both equally and mutually reliant upon each other.
So it's much more a model of without the two components being added together, there's no sense of completeness. It's not like inferior state and complementary state.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I suppose this picks back up on what Professor Deborah was saying before the break, doesn't it, really? This whole idea that kind of equality doesn't mean everybody being exactly the same.
Yeah, that's it. Rather than equality meaning, like you just said, rather than it meaning exactly the same, it means that you're equal almost through your difference, and that it's the difference between the two which makes them both equally important. So both equally needed to serve the purpose of marriage. So I think what the main key idea is that marriage is supposed to be, according to the Bible, it's supposed to be God serving, and in order for that to happen, the two are needed, and they both serve almost different roles, but each role is equally important. Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Jihi, let me ask you, if I may do, sorry to drop in on you. I mean, how does that resonate with thinking on marriage across India? Is there a kind of sense of that reinterpretation of what equality means? Does that have resonance for you as a scholar of women's studies?
I believe that with increasing education and job opportunities with women, even there in India, there's some sort of, it brings education and having financial stability within yourself puts you in a position where you feel more empowered. For example, if you have source of earning, you can think of getting out of a abusive marriage, which was missing earlier. So yeah, there's definitely a change, and a religion, as we have been investigating it for all these years, can be used as, and I would again say that not necessarily be a means to oppress women, but can also be interpreted as and used as empowering women. So yeah.
I think it was really interesting, again, bearing in mind what you just about, Chloe, and what Professor Deborah was saying, this whole idea that there are certainly things in the Bible, and I'm sure this is true of other texts as well, there are certainly things in the Bible that can be used to oppress women. I mean, I happen to be a Christian as well, and I think when I read the New Testament, I'm very impressed by, for the context and for the time, the New Testament is remarkably empowering to women. Now, in the last 2,000 years, I feel we've at least come some way. We've still got a long way to go, but we've at least come some way in that. And maybe some of the things that 2,000 years ago were incredibly progressive feel a little bit less so today's world, but it's still important to realise in their time.
Yeah, so true. And as you always say that, the glass is the same, but from where are you seeing it depends your perspective about it. So, and therefore there comes a need for platforms like this, where we can have narratives from different places, different genders, and then can draw